December 11th, 1969 was one of the stormiest nights of the year, seeing sheets of rain and gale-force winds pummeling what is typically known as the Sunshine Coast of BC. On this night, 12 killer whales made their way close to the shore, possibly looking for a safe place to ride out the storm. But this place was anything but safe, because unbeknownst to the family, local fishermen had been waiting for this exact opportunity to present itself once more since their last killer whale capture over a year prior. For over 15 hours, the fishermen battled the storm and the whales, eventually netting several of them in Pender Harbor, and in the following days netting all 12. Amongst the orca was a young female thought to be around 5 years old who would eventually receive the name Corky II. While the whales were penned in the harbor, the fishermen were under constant threat from the public, receiving nasty telegrams and phone calls, and they worried that much like with their last catch, that somebody would come by and cut the nets, so they needed to make quick work of the sale of the whales. He and two of her podmates, Kenny and Patches, would be sold to Marineland of the Pacific in California, and on December 26, 1969, they would be loaded onto a plane and transported to their new life in a tank. When Corky and her companions arrived, they were greeted by familiar faces. You see, the three young orca were northern resident killer whales and part of the greater A5 pod, and there were already 2 whales residing at the park at the time of Corky's arrival, Orkid II and the original Corky, both of whom were also part of the A5 pod and had been caught in the same harbor over a year prior. Corky would have known these whales well. She would have played with them for years as small calves in the wild, and the familiarity would have been a small mercy. With the addition of the 3 young orca, Marineland of the Pacific now had the largest collection of captive orca in the world. In 1970, the original Corky would pass away, and the name was passed on to Corky II. The following year, Kenny would pass away, and then in 1972, Patches would follow. This left Corky and Orky as the last 2 remaining orca at Marineland of the Pacific, and they were stars, going on to feature in several films including Whale of a Tale, Orca, and Tentacle. The cousins got along exceptionally well, and much to the park's delight, Corky became pregnant, and on February 28, 1977, Corky would produce the first living captive killer whale calf. Despite Corky's attentive nature, the calf would never nurse and would repeatedly bump its head into the tank walls. On March 15th, the calf sank to the bottom of the tank and died. Gestation for an orca is between 15 to 18 months, and wild orca females typically produce a calf every 3 to 5 years. But Corky would be impregnated almost immediately after the death of her first calf, and on October 31st of the following year, she produced her second calf, who would receive the name Spooky because of his birthday. Much like Corky's first calf, Spooky wasn't coordinated enough to avoid the walls of his small circular tank. Corky desperately tried to protect her calf from smacking into the concrete by putting her face between the calf and the tank, and it was starting to become apparent that Corky's intervention was confusing her calves. In the wild, calves swim in endless straight lines in something called echelon position. This is where the calf rides in mom's slipstream right behind her dorsal fin. This means they spend a significant amount of time next to their mother's flank patch. Right next to the flank patch is where the orca's mammaries sit. Because the calves were constantly presented with Corky's eye patch, they were confused where to nurse from, and ultimately staff made the choice to tube feed Spooky. Corky and Orky were tolerant of the tube feeding, but the concoction was experimental, and eventually the decision was made to remove Spooky from the tank altogether to make tube feeding easier. Corky was devastated. For an hour, she slammed into the walls of her tank over and over again, and then proceeded to scream for her baby for the next 3 days. Spooky died on November 10th. During Corky's 3rd pregnancy, she became obsessed with the stuffed orca at the gift shop and would sometimes spend hours staring at them. Then, one morning, she violently rammed the glass, shattering it and causing a leak in the tank. Shortly after this, she would have a stillborn on April 1st, 1980. Despite Corky's losses, she always had the companionship of her cousin and mate Orky, and Alexandra Morton noticed that the two had a private life and would change their behavior when trainers arrived, and even had a morning ritual. Every morning as the sun arose, the whales would squirt water and lick a specific spot on the tank wall. They would do this until the sunlight crept over the stadium walls, where the first beam of light would hit that exact spot. Corky's intense affection towards Orky was constantly used as a way to control her more rebellious side. When Corky was pregnant with her 4th calf, Kiva, Corky was performing high-energy behaviors that the trainers didn't ask for. But rather than punish Corky directly for her insubordinance, they would instead cut Orky's rations. Orca are empathetic and social animals, so you can see how this would force Corky back in line. While Corky was pregnant with Kiva, trainers took advantage of her interest in orca stuffies, and she was trained to present her mammaries to her future calves by using a lifelike replica of a baby orca. Staff hoped that this would solve the issue that they had been having with her calves fixating on her eye patch. Kiva was born on June 18, 1982, and just like the calves that came before her, she was unable to maneuver her body in a way that would avoid hitting the concrete walls, and once again, Corky placed her face between the calf and the wall. Corky remembered her training and attempted to roll over and present her memories to the small baby, but to no avail. In the wild, Corky would have been surrounded by family. Her mother and other females would have helped her get that calf to nurse. But at Marineland, Corky had no female companions. The staff at Marineland tried to grab Kiva to guide her towards Corky's memories, but when they would do this, Corky would turn her body, making it impossible. Staff were desperate to keep Kiva alive. They even drained the tank and attempted to milk Corky, but they couldn't get the milk to flow. Eventually, just like with the others, staff would resort to tube feeding Kiva. Kiva was outliving all the calves that came before her, but a month and a half after her birth, Corky began hitting Kiva's belly hard and repeatedly. This seemingly aggressive act caused staff to separate the calf from Corky. Kiva would die a couple of days later. She was Corky's longest surviving calf, living 47 days. When an autopsy was performed, they found Kiva's insides were filled with gas. Orca have incredible echolocation, and Corky would have been able to see this. When Corky was hitting Kiva, while it was violent and would seem like an aggressive act, she was more than likely just trying to do the whale version of burping the calf. Corky would have her 5th calf on July 22nd, 1985, and just like the others, the calf would need to be tube-fed. The little female would only survive 29 days. Corky would experience 2 more pregnancies, one in 1986 and one in 1987. Both would end in miscarriages. Orca are one of only a handful of animals that experience true menopause, which often happens around the age of 40. But at just 23 years old, after experiencing 7 pregnancies in a little over 10 years, Corky's body gave up on reproduction, and she would never become pregnant again. In December of 1986, Marineland of the Pacific would be sold to SeaWorld, and on January 21st, 1987, Corky and Orky would be transferred to SeaWorld San Diego. Up to this point, Corky, who is now in her early 20s, would have never socialized with an orca outside of her population. Even in captivity, all she was ever housed with was her family members from the greater A5 pod of the northern resident killer whales. However, when she arrived at SeaWorld, she would have been thrust into a new world with unfamiliar and familiar ecotypes. And I can't stress enough how particular wild orca are about the company they keep. In the Pacific Northwest, where Corky hails from, she had the potential to encounter different resident populations, transient populations, and offshore populations, but she would have never openly interacted with any of these groups. In fact, in the rare instance that populations do interact, it's usually very unpleasant. Corky was now meeting Icelandic whales and, interestingly, a transient killer whale, a whale that in the wild would be considered an enemy of sorts. And to make matters worse, Corky was and is still considered a submissive female, while all her new female tank mates had dominating personalities. But Corky's cousin and longtime breeding partner Orky welcomed the chance to interact with new females and quickly impregnated the 2 Icelandic females. But the fun times wouldn't last. On April 26, 1988, Corky would lose her longtime companion, cousin, and father of her children when Orky would pass away. In September of that same year, Orky's daughter Orkid would be born to Can-Do 5. Corky, who clearly had a strong urge to mother but no calves of her own, took a liking to Orkid, and the two developed a strong bond. Orkid's mother, Can-Do, wasn't a fan of this relationship, and as the dominant female, she had no problem showing Corky who was boss. Can-Do would assert her dominance over Corky so often that SeaWorld veterinarian Jim McBain described the behavior as ritualized combat. This all came to a head on August 21st, 1989, when Corky, Can-Do, and Orkid were all supposed to be doing a show together, when Can-Do tried to ram Corky with her mouth open, missed Corky, and hit the tank wall instead. For the next 45 minutes, Corky and little Orkid would watch Can-Do bleed to death from a severed artery. After Can-Do's death, Corky would become like a surrogate mother to Orkid, and to this very day the pair remains close. Corky's gentle and loving nature has seen her offer guidance to many young orca that have come to SeaWorld San Diego, and when new whales would come to the park, Corky was often the first whale that they met. She's also known as a fantastic starter whale for new trainers because of her reliable behavior. That being said, Corky has had some behavioral issues at SeaWorld. In 1990, she pushed a trainer in the midsection, in 1994, she pushed another trainer, and in 2000, she blocked a trainer from exiting the pool. And unfortunately, Corky's submissive behavior has led to other problems as well. In 1990, Kasatka arrived at SeaWorld San Diego after years of being passed around various SeaWorld parks. Kasatka was the dominant whale, and while she would grow close with Corky, she suppressed the last piece of home Corky had, her dialect. Kasatka was a wild-caught Icelandic orca, and she was known to rake Corky if she made A5 pod calls. Those calls, the calls of her family, were so important to Corky. In 1993, the movie Free Willy was released. People were moved by the story of a wild orca taken from his family to perform in a small concrete tank, only to be released and live happily ever after. At the time, Corky's presumed mother Stripe was very much alive, along with 3 of her siblings. The calls to release Corky started to grow, and in that same year, ABC obtained tapes of her family's calls from researcher Paul Spong and played them to Corky and her tank mates. While the other orca at SeaWorld seemed deeply interested and even vocalized, Corky's entire body began to shudder when she heard her family.
Voices of her family for the first time in nearly 24 years. The SeaWorld orcas all respond to the tape. At one point, Corky begins to shudder. That's her in the back.
Then, after a relatively peaceful few years since Candu's death, Corky would meet a new adversary, an Icelandic killer whale male named Ulysses. Just like so many before him, Ulysses had been captured young, but unlike most, he would spend most of his formative years without the company of other orca. More dominant females, including Kasatka, didn't have issues with Ulysses, and have even been known to rake him. But with Corky being such a submissive whale, Ulysses has become aggressive with her to the point of injury. In one particular incident, Ulysses bit Corky's fluke, removing a chunk out of it and causing a severe infection. Ulysses' behavior toward Corky is so intense that Corky is known to completely shut down around him, and SeaWorld has had to implement policies where Corky and Ulysses can't be together unless Kasatka, who's now deceased, or Orkid are in there with them. Despite this, Corky and Ulysses have lived at the same facility in close proximity to each other for over 30 years now, and have even performed in shows together. Corky has no choice in her captive family, and is a prime example of why artificial pairings in captivity can be so dangerous. If Corky was still in the wild, she would have the option to flee any potential aggressor. Chances are also very good that she would not only be a mother, but a grandmother. She would travel with her children and grandbabies, and potentially even her brother and her sister's family. She would get to meet up and socialize with a variety of northern resident killer whales and form lifelong bonds with unrelated animals, and she would spend her summers gathering at rubbing beaches, which are basically sacred for her kind. She would get to use her massive brain and specialized echolocation to track down and hunt fish, and she would spend her days speaking her native tongue. Instead, Corky is known to display various stereotypies which are a product of stress and or boredom. She is famous for swimming upside down for prolonged periods. She's also known to regurgitate her food, and she's worn her teeth down to nothing by chewing on the concrete and metal that makes up her tanks. She also developed cataracts in her right eye a long time ago, potentially from her chlorinated living environment, and is now partially blind. Every year I'm fortunate enough to see Corky's family, her brother Fife and her sister Ripple. I watch Ripple's grandcalves frolic with other young whales, and while all this is such a beautiful sight, I always feel an intense sadness knowing that Corky will never get to experience this. This life was stolen from her. Corky is now estimated to be 60 years old, and today marks the 56th anniversary of her capture. That's 56 years in an unnatural environment for your entertainment.